some, and it's going into very few pockets. The real wages for the majority have pretty much stagnated. That's prior to the collapse, in which everything crashed. People have gotten by, sort of, but they've gotten by sharply increasing work hours. They're now far beyond Europe, which is a scandal in itself, which is the richest, most privileged country in the world. It's got incomparable advantages. But work hours are far higher than Europe or other industrial countries. People have gone deeply into debt. It's, of course, unsustainable. And they've capitalized on the regular bubbles that have begun ever since the early Reagan years. As deregulation said, there were no financial crises in the 50s and 60s. The New Deal regulations were in place. But starting in the late 70s, particularly in the Reagan years, there's a kind of a fanatic pressure for deregulation, and it predictably led to repeated crises. During bubbles, blow up, and people think they're wealthy, but then it collapses, and you see that it's all paid for. Well, the latest one, they get worse each time. The latest one was the housing bubble, and when that crashed, there were literally $8 trillion of fake wealth disappeared. That's why people can't consume, and most people's assets were in their houses, which were fake. If you haven't read it yet, you should read the New York Times this morning. Yesterday, the Federal Reserve released, as it does every year, it releases records from discussions 5 years earlier, so you can find out what the Fed was talking about 5 years ago. And they released them for 2006. And it's pretty incredible to look at. I advise you to do it. These are, highly trained economists, bankers. They could see that house prices were going way out of sight, and no relation whatsoever to any economic fundamentals, and off a track that had been going on for 100 years. For about 100 years, house prices pretty much tracked gross domestic product, the size of the economy, as you expect. About 10 years ago, they started shooting off into the distance, no basis for it. But they said it's fine, nothing's happening. And the reason why nothing's happening is because there is a religion. We can laugh about extremist religious groups, but these are some of the most educated, smartest people in the world, trapped in religious beliefs. The religions had been pointed out. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, about 17 or 18 years ago, warned the profession that they should not be seduced by what he called the religion that markets know best. They don't. And you look at history, you see reliance on markets is a disaster over and over. But the religion took over. Nobody questioned it. Alan Greenspan was St. Alan, greatest economist of all time. But just read the discussions from 5 years ago, just a few months before the whole thing crashed. They tell you a lot about our intellectual culture, and it's sobering and revealing. Anyway, that's how people have been getting by. And none of this happens because of economic laws, or it's not the result of technology, it's no other standard evasions. It's by design. Just a couple of weeks ago, there's a very good organization, the Economic Policy Institute. It annually puts out the standard kind of databases about what's going on in the economy. A very good analysis to state of work in America. It's cool. They just came out with a small monograph reviewing what they've been describing and analyzing for the last 25 years. It's called Failure by Design, and it's exactly the right title. It's a failure for some, I'll come back to that, decline in the rate of profit in manufacturing, so that people who are trying to make money, have capital to invest, look for where you can make money. And since there's a decline in the rate of profit in manufacturing here, you go to where you can make more profit, like by, assembling Apple computers in Foxconn in China, Taiwanese-owned factory in China in utterly hideous conditions, suicides, strikes, and so on. But you make a lot of money that way, and also just by financial manipulation. And that was expedited by the fact that by something else that happened. There had been an international economic system, the Bretton Woods system, which was established by Britain and the United States, the two victors of the Second World War, right after the Second World War. And it sort of, on the British side, it was John Maynard Keynes, and the American side, Harry Dexter White, Roosevelt economists. And they kind of planned out a system, sort of designed to encourage growth and equitable growth. And in fact, that worked. In the 50s and the 60s is the highest growth period in modern economic history over a long stretch. And it was equitable. So the lowest quintile did about as well as the highest quintile. It's sometimes called the golden age of capitalism. Well, that was based on the Bretton Woods system, which had a number of principles to it. One of them was control over capital. So capital controls, you can't just export capital, and regulated currencies. You can't speculate against currency. So that cut down financial, chicanery, and it drove investment towards productive investment. Well, that broke down in the early 70s for various reasons. That changed those things changed the economy enormously. So you go back to the 50s and the 60s. The banks were banks. They were doing what you're supposed to do in a kind of state capitalist economy like ours. They take unused capital, like say your bank account, and lend it to somebody who's trying to do something productive with it, like start business or buy a house or send a piece of college or whatever it might be. And they were a small part of the economy. Now